Now before we commit these, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of things. First of all, let's talk about ignoring files. Now I use an editor called Komodo, and when I want to create a new project, I go to Project, New Project, and then I go to the site directory where my site is. I'm going to name my project loc.gitsite.com, and notice the extension here is Komodo project. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And what this does is create a file inside of my directory for the project information. So if I went back to the command line and I did git status, you'd see we now have this untracked file along with all of our files that we've added to the staging area. Now this is a file I don't want to add to my repository because it's just something I'll be working on locally. And depending on what type of environment you're in and what editor you use, there might be additional files that you see here. Now for non-Drupal projects, you can use a .gitignore file, but because Drupal comes with a .gitignore file already, it's a good idea to leave it as is. In general, you don't want to make any modifications to Drupal core, and that includes a gitignore file. So let's go ahead and open that up and take a look really quick at what it is. So here I am in the root directory of my Drupal site, and here's the .gitignore file. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. This file is actually pretty simple. It just contains lines of regular expressions that indicate the patterns of files that need to be ignored. So for example, we have a couple of comments here and here. You can tell because they begin with a hashtag. And then we have a regular expression here, here, and here. So this first one says ignore everything in sites and then any folder within sites. So this would come into play with a multi-site installation, settings, and then anything after settings, and then .php. So when you create a site, you create a settings.php file, and that's one file that will be ignored here. In general, we want to ignore the settings.php file because it contains information about our database, and that's usually specific to our particular environment. We're going to be using a different database locally than we're going to be using on the live site. Also, settings.php may contain some other configuration that might be specific to your site. In a later video, we'll show how to use the settings.php file in order to include some global settings so that you can have a version controlled file with the settings that would normally be in settings.php that you do want to persist across all environments. This also says to ignore the files and private directories within our sites/whatever directory. So this would come into play for sites all files, for example, or sites default files. The reason why files and private are excluded is because they usually contain information that you don't want version controlled. The files in these folders are usually binary, like images or zip files, and because of this, they're not version controlled very nicely. Every time you version control a binary file, every time there's a modification, the entire binary file has to be copied in a revision. Whereas in a text file, if you make a modification on a couple of lines, then just that modification is saved rather than the entire file. Also, text files are very small, whereas image files tend to be a lot larger. A second reason to ignore these folders is that they're usually pretty dynamic on the live site. So if you have an active environment with a lot of users, you have people uploading files and removing files all of the time, and there's no real reason to version control them or add revision information about them because that's just not part of the active environment. However, keeping regular backups of these folders is important, and the backup of these files plus version control on the source code will allow you to create a pretty similar environment locally to what you have on the live site. And so if you looked carefully at our initial commit, you would notice that it didn't include the settings.php file, and it didn't include the files or private directories as well. Now again, because this comes with Drupal by default, we don't want to modify this, and the reason is that if Drupal gets upgraded and there's a change to this file, we want to bring in the change without risking losing our own. So instead, what we're going to do is go into this .git folder, going to expand it, we're going to go into the info folder, and we're going to open the exclude file. Now this works just the same as the .gitignore file, but because this is individual to our repository instead of the Drupal installation, then we can use this safely. So let's go ahead and add a line here at the end for star, that's just an indicator of anything, and then .komodoproject. Now again, this is coming from our command line where we see that we have our loc gitsite.com.komodoproject file. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and then I'm going to exit it. And now if we go back to the command line and we use git status again, we'll see that this loc.gitsite.com file no longer displays. And by ignoring this, we've done a couple of things. First of all, it cleans up our output. So now we're not looking at a file that we don't ever intend to add to our repository every time we use git status. And secondly, this will prevent us from accidentally including this file when we use broad add commands.